Kim, thank you so much for your Brighton landscape vision. It was amazing, and we've got two or three of us from the Savills team here today to try and test your mettle, as it were, with some questions on your plan. So, on the top of my screen, I've got Molly Bedell from our research team. Hi, Molly.
Hi, Keith, thank you. And hello, Kim, thank you very much. Excited to be here today. Yes, I'm from the research team, so I'm Savills Rural Research. I specialise in agri-environmental policy and all things natural capital.
Kim below, who you've met already in our previous session. Hi, Kim.
Hello, Keith. Yes, I'm a landscape architect working with Savills on the plan for Brighton and Hove.
And I'm Keith Arnott from Savills. I head up the Savills Rural Management team for the Brighton Hove Estate Management contract. Well, Kim, we've had a fantastic summer walking the Downs for you to have an opportunity to get stuck into this project. We found it really invigorating and exciting, and to ably assist me with some intelligent questions, Molly's kindly stepped up to the mark. We thought it would be an opportunity just to raise sort of informally some questions and answers around your presentation, which we found very informative. So over the course of the summer, we've obviously spent a lot of time at Brighton and looked at the landscape in the context of, I like the phrase intergenerational rather than 100 years or 5-year plans and 10-year plans, because it is, from my view, an intergenerational change that we would be seeking to achieve. But for everybody else listening in, could you perhaps provide a brief contextualized summary of the vision that you've put together and you kindly presented to us earlier today?
Yeah, I mean, what is extraordinary is that a century ago, Brighton and Hove had the foresight to buy this land to protect the aquifer. And it is an extraordinary landscape that was created by great tectonic alpine orogeny. And what has come out of that is an amazing chalk downland landscape with the coast, the downland, and then the weald on beyond that. And because of that, it's a landscape of clean water, amazing wildlife, and a landscape that the city has direct access to, a really beautiful, incredible landscape of views and topography. And essentially, it's a question of how we manage that landscape for the next few generations to make sure that everything special about it survives and thrives.
And Kim, I'm interested there, you sort of started with water, and from my perspective, with a kind of natural capital lens, water is a key ecosystem service, clearly impacted by the landscape. You've mentioned that the Downs were initially purchased to protect the city's aquifer. When you were approaching this study and this project, how did you sort of initially look at water security and water provision within this strategic landscape plan?
Well, the beauty of chalk is that it absorbs the water and cleans it as it goes down into the aquifer. So the crucial things are how to keep that chalk stable and absorbent, how to make sure that the land isn't ploughed in crucial spots where the soil will be eroded, or that percolation down into the aquifer is somehow interrupted. But also to understand how the covering of topsoil and plants is totally integral to that process of water absorption, but also creates the flora and the insect life and the microbial life that balances the whole lot and makes it such an extraordinary landscape of life, of living things.
So it's very much interrelated, obviously your soil and your water and what they can sustain and hold. So it's not so much a question of looking at one thing in specifics, but the whole broader picture around soil, water, ecosystem service provision.
Absolutely, and topography and the aspect where the wind and the weather is driving from, where the slopes are really steep, all of those things, they're all part of that same picture, yes.
That's really interesting.
Kim, I think on your second to last slide, you set out your Brighton landscape. Could you just explain the steps and the process that you went through to come up with that Brighton landscape?
Well, the first two steps were actually thanks to Brighton and Hove themselves. They superimposed the contours on top of an aerial photograph, which is a fantastic way of understanding how the land works, and then setting it in the context of historical maps. So with that, we were able to go out and walk every inch of that landscape and understand it and record it and see where the key views are, see how the city works with the land, see where the land is being well farmed and not so well farmed. So it was a combination of understanding the key elements of it, the topography and the vegetation and the aspect, and then to walk it with you through a very, very beautiful summer.
Summer, I might hasten to add as well.
Kim, I think it's really interesting that you said that you looked back at the sort of the history book to look at how we could assess the future design of the landscape. In general, with your work, how important is it to look back at previous landscapes? And something I'm interested in is, how do you choose which parts of the past to incorporate? Where's the line between too much of the past and when do you sort of push that into the future?
Great question. There are two sides to that. One is that landscape is the story of human beings on the land. I mean, it is that cultural landscape that folds in with the physical landscape that makes it the really rich place that it is. But also, this is a very old landscape. I mean, thousands of years it's been tended and inhabited by human beings. And so what the maps tell us is what has worked and what has not worked. And you just look back 100 years and there were not very many trees on this landscape. And it wasn't very ploughed either. It was largely a chalk grassland landscape that was very carefully grazed and managed. And so the history not only gives us the cultural context, but it actually teaches us what worked and what didn't work in the past.
It's really interesting. Thank you.
Clearly, in any landscape, there's multiple demands on land, all of which hold significant value to a range of users. How do you go about prioritizing interventions and choosing who benefits?
I think really the first consideration is what works for the land itself, what will keep it productive, stable, full of life, human and wild, for as far ahead as we can see. And I think the context then of how the land works with life and water and soil and climate is the top priority. The great thing about the Brighton landscape is that actually chalk grassland is really good for securing carbon. Ironically, well-grazed, deep-rooted herbal chalk grassland sequesters carbon into the ground 3 times faster than trees do. And so in itself, it's a fantastic landscape for the future. But it's also very resilient to human access. You saw from those slides how many people are using that landscape and using it sensitively without destroying it. So that, in combination with 1,000-year-old grazing techniques and just being respectful of how that land and water works together, the choices aren't very difficult. It's actually just managing it extremely well, and it works for human beings, wildlife, and water all together.
And we spent quite a lot of time on the tree debate, Kim, and your plan has tried to create some space for those. Would you like to just enlarge a little bit around how you think that requirement could be accommodated?
Well, one of the beautiful ways that Brighton and Hove have actually nestled into that landscape is by, on the whole, keeping to the wooded valleys. And where the trees are combined with the houses in those valleys, you get the benefit of protection from climate, and also when you're looking back at that landscape where the houses are nestled in trees, they don't obtrude into that landscape. Similarly with the road, with the A27 and other roads, it's a very good way of making human habitation and settlement link with a landscape of great scale. It's a big landscape, and you don't want little bitty intrusions into it if it's going to work.
So Kim, you've sort of got a very exciting job in that the material that you work with is nature. Not everyone can claim to be using nature as their main material. Obviously today, and increasingly, the human management of nature is a very contentious issue. Where do you sit, and how do you deal with the tensions between the human intervention and the let's just let wilderness take over debate around sort of nature management?
Yeah, it's completely fascinating. The word wild absolutely does intrigue me, because up until about a century ago, wild meant hostile to humans. Now it means generally absence of humans, and therefore it is good. And the idea that, and contrasted with that is natural. And natural seems to be a harmonious combination of all forms of life and land. And so as we move forward, I hope humans are here to stay, and how we can coexist with natural systems is the really crucial question. Just abandoning land can work in some places, but actually for most of Britain, human beings have worked with natural systems extremely well. And some of our most precious and biodiverse landscapes are actually the ones where human beings have been intervening for thousands of years. So water meadows, coppice woodland, heathland, those are areas of, and particularly, of course, chalk grassland, they're areas of juvenile landscapes because they haven't succeeded to full climax woodland. And in those juvenile landscapes, you get most life and most vigor. And so working out how that level of intervention, that sympathy of coexistence can work is what most fascinates me about this landscape.
And just to bring it to the sort of Brighton and Hove specific level, was that a tension that you were constantly assessing as you were sort of putting this vision together, sort of zoning areas to see where you think most intervention would be necessary and least, or was it like that or not quite?
It was more that there's a really good backbeat of grazed downland, which is basically the default position. And it was a question of where should we allow some trees to be planted, where should scrub be managed, should there be any arable in that landscape, and if so, where can it go? But the underlying thing is that it should be extensively grazed chalk grassland. That's what makes it so special.
And clearly a very important role for farmers in managing these natural landscapes. But can farming and farmers deliver these things, Kim? Can farmers be aesthetic stewards, carbon sequestrators, and food producers all at the same time?
Absolutely they can. And one of the things that is most interesting is how, since the Second World War, farming has been knocked off course from doing all of those things at once, because farmers, above all, have a sense of how to keep land fertile and in good health for hundreds of years. You can't look 5 years ahead as a farmer. And so what has happened since the Second World War is that, understandably, government policy has skewed farmers into producing maximum yields without considering what happens to the soil underneath. So it's maximum yields for a very short period, rather than continuity of healthy food and healthy water in perpetuity. And with the agriculture and environment bills that are going through at the moment, I think we have the chance to return to a much more sensible long-term vision of farming.
Is this space for regenerative agriculture versus our more traditional established techniques?
Well, actually, I would argue that regenerative agriculture is our long-term traditional technique, and we've just been through a bizarre blip since the Second World War, which we can put right now. Farming the land well for the health of soil is what we've always done, and we can return to that with more sophistication and technology than before. But basically, those underlying principles are what government policy and government support should be about, and not short-term maximum yields of unhealthy food.
Kim, your vision is ultimately founded, well, not ultimately, but is central to it is the idea of aesthetics in the sort of idea of landscape design, but clearly it also speaks to a natural capital agenda. And your suggestions within the plan involve woodland creation, investment in the downland pasture techniques, which by term would increase biodiversity and carbon sequestration. Now, what was the sort of ecosystem service provision side of this intentional, or do you think it's just a coincidence that what looks best is also the best in terms of ecosystem service provision?
The great thing about English aesthetics and the English landscape movement is that it's completely based in functionality. So Alexander Pope, who was really one of the big thinkers behind the English landscape movement, famously said, consult the genius of the place, what makes it a place, and the use, and with the beauties resulting from that combination rather than being forced into it. So actually, what is beautiful in landscape is something that is functional and works well. And what we love in our farmed landscape is successful, healthy farming. That's what we find beautiful. So I think they all fit together instinctively.
And moving on from that then, do you think, would it be fair enough to say that society's idea of what looks good in nature changes over time because of what we come to understand its functionality being?
Fashion changes a lot over time, but actually deep down, the English and the British love of landscape has been on a kind of Arcadian model of gently grazed and well-tended land, where human beings are working in harmony with that land. And you look at our music, our literature, our art, and it's all about that harmonious relationship with land. So I think from the sort of the Roman Augustan poets right through to the arts and crafts movement and the hippie flower power movement, there's been a sense of continuous gentle understanding of what's good for land is beautiful in land.
You've talked a lot throughout your presentation, and we've talked on it today in this Q&A session, about how well-managed landscapes can underpin and support an ecosystem servicing based approach. But as a takeaway, and I know this is a sort of $1 million question, but if you were to encapsulate your presentation earlier and our Q&A session today, 3 or 4 do's and don'ts for Brighton to take away, your learnings from the summer and the work that you've done on the Brighton plan, what would they be?
I think that essentially this is an extraordinary landscape of grazed pasture land, of chalk downland, and all of the wildlife that goes along with that. So making that the fundamental basis of how this land should be treated and supported is the top priority. Then deciding where trees should go and how it should work with settlement is another fairly key issue of what we do next. And supporting the farmers to have the right stocking levels, only to plough where it is sympathetic with the land, is another key one. And then looking at how that landscape will work with people using it without destroying it is pretty key. So where the key views are, which are back to the coast, across the city, and then working out actually how education and interpretation can work in certain focal places as well. I think all of these things can fit together very naturally, and the government, in its refocusing of how to support land and farming, can really help that. And there's a sort of a lovely coincidence of all of that will be good for saving the water for the city, which is why it originally got the land in the first place. But it's a fantastic recreational resource, and if we treat the land right, a microbial resource, which will mean that the food and the wildlife are really invigorated with a new life that's based deep in the microbes of the soil.
Well, Kim, that's great, and what a note to end on. I know Molly and I are itching to ask you heaps more questions, but in the interest of our 40-minute Zoom account, we might pull stumps. But just to say thank you very much for all your time today. Thank you for those that are listening elsewhere. Kim, Molly and I are very much looking forward to working with you and Brighton City Council as our wet journey continues. Thank you very much.
Keith, Molly, thanks very much.